Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the Brookings Institution. I'm Suzanne Maloney. I'm the Interim Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at Brookings. Today we are really delighted and thrilled to be gathered to discuss Tanvi Madan's latest book, Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped U.S. India Relations During the Cold War. I bought my copy at the bookstore out front. You shall too, I hope. As you all know from her bio, and because you've joined us here today, Tanvi is the director of the India Project and a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy in our Foreign Policy program here at Brookings. Her research examines India's foreign policy, its role in the world, focusing particularly on India's relationship with China and with the United States. In 2 weeks, U.S.-India relations will be in the spotlight when President Trump travels to India for the first time as president. Looming in the background will be the two countries' concerns about China, which have been a significant driver of U.S.-Indian partnership over the last 2 decades. In her book, Tanvi takes us back and demonstrates that the centrality of China to U.S.-India relations goes back much further in the history of the two countries' relationship. Through extensive archival research in India and in the United States, Tanvi disentangles how American and Indian perceptions of and policy toward China shaped the U.S.-Indian relationship throughout the Cold War. In the finest tradition of Brookings, Fateful Triangle has tremendous value for both scholars and policymakers, as well as all those interested in Asia, U.S. and Indian foreign policy, diplomatic history, and international relations more broadly. It really provides a unique and important contribution to the existing scholarship on the U.S.-Indian relationship, taking it beyond South Asia to the broader Asian context. Tanvi's book offers both lessons and insights about the possibilities and limits of U.S.-Indian cooperation in the context of a rising China. Following Tanvi's opening remarks on the book and its key findings, she will join Kurt Campbell and Tom Wright for a panel discussion. We are really delighted to welcome Kurt, who is the chairman and chief executive officer of the Asia Group. You have his bio as well, but in addition to his time as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, he's also written numerous books, including The Pivot, The Future of American Statecraft in Asia. Tom Wright, who will be moderating the discussion, is the director of our Center on the U.S. and Europe, a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy, and himself the author of a number of publications, including a fantastic book. He writes extensively on great power competition. So now, without further ado, I'm turning the stage over to Tanvi and look forward to her remarks.
I guess this is going to go on. Who's doing the PowerPoint? There we go. Thank you, Suzanne, and I'm grateful to you and also to Kurt and Tom for participating in this event. Thanks also to Anju Bois, Laura McGee, Jennifer Mason, Anna Newby, Suzanne Schaefer, Adriana Peter and her team for putting this event together so speedily, and to all of you for coming here this morning. So this book has been a decade in the making. I won't thank everyone who made it possible. It'll take up the rest of the event, and whatever Brookings' version of Oscar's Wrap It Up music is will probably drown me out, so I won't do that. But I hope you'll indulge me for at least a couple of minutes as I acknowledge 2 sets of people without whom this book would not have been possible. First are my parents, Anishi and Viren Madan, and my sister, Nidhi. The book is dedicated to them because their support was indispensable to its journey and to its completion, most importantly. And it has always felt more like a family project than an individual one. Second, I want to acknowledge the support of the Brookings Institution, and particularly my colleagues here at Foreign Policy. I'm incredibly fortunate to work in a place where book-length research is still encouraged and to be surrounded by smart and good people. Now, on to what you're here for. So this book originated at another institution I owe much to, the University of Texas at Austin. More particularly, it originated in the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library that was next door in Austin to where I was, and where I was researching U.S.-India relations. I wasn't really satisfied with existing explanations of what shaped U.S.-India relations. So there were some things that we'd kind of learned, the factors like culture or U.S.-India differences over Pakistan or the Soviet Union. These factors to me didn't explain, they did explain estrangement in the relationship. They did explain why there was continuity in the U.S.-India relationship over time. But to me and to a number of others, especially as the Indian archives were opening up, what these existing factors didn't quite explain is why the US and India, nonetheless, during the course of their history, why they actually did engage with each other. And these factors also didn't explain what really explained change in the relationship, because the standard line that everybody uses, the US-India relationship has experienced many ups and downs. So if it was Pakistan, for example, those differences existed continuously. What really caused change? And what I found in the Lyndon Johnson Library and the papers intrigued me. Two things in particular. One was I came across a document or a set of documents that were essentially the US operational plans to intervene militarily on behalf of India in 1965 during the course of an India-Pakistan war if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan. The second set of documents that I came across were very kind of detailed and, to me, boring logs of rainfall amounts in India and their impact on the Indian agricultural landscape and the Indian economy. Now, why did these people care about this, and what a reason these were on, why LBJ and his officials were kind of going through these logs? They seemed to keep a close eye on them because they wanted to make sure that India succeeded. Democratic India succeeded in the 60s, and especially in the context of a communist China next door that they were very worried about, that it would beat India in the kind of economic race and the strategic race in Asia. Why did this intrigue me? Today it is almost a truth almost universally acknowledged that China drives and shapes US-India relations. Indeed, broad convergence on China has been a key driver of US-India relations for the last 2 decades across US administrations and across Indian governments. Even if China was not mentioned during these visits up here on the PowerPoint presentation, during the Obama and Trump administrations, China nonetheless loomed large behind these big hugs between Prime Minister Modi and these two leaders. But what I had found, and that's why what I found in the LBJ archives intrigued me, what I'd found was that China's role in shaping the US-India relationship was not just a recent phenomena restricted to kind of the last few decades. Indeed, what I found, and this book lays out, was that China's influence went back to the early years of Indian independence. And the book takes you back to 1949 and starts at that point, where China was indeed what lay behind another visit. That is Indian Prime Minister Nehru's visit as the first Indian Prime Minister to ever visit Washington. When he came in 1949, he received a warm welcome on his arrival. President Truman indeed went to the airport to receive him, taking along 3 cabinet members and an honor guard. The US Congress hosted Nehru for a speech. Why all this fanfare behind the visit of this Indian leader? A major reason was what had happened just before Nehru's visit to Washington, what American policymakers saw as the loss of China to communism. And this had happened just a few days before, on October 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China. The establishment in the US now saw, in that context, a democratic India as the hope of Asia and believed it could serve as a counterbalance and contrast to Soviet-backed communist China. But during the course of this kind of visit that Nehru takes with much fanfare, it became quite clear that India did not share the same view of or the same approach to China as the US did. And so instead of convergence in China pushing the US and India together, over the next few years, what you really see in the US-India partnership and between the two countries is divergence on the subject of China. They disagreed about a number of different things, whether to recognize the People's Republic of China or not, what to do about the Chinese takeover of Tibet, China's role in the Korean War, and the reasons for its intervention in that war, China's role in Southeast Asia. They also disagreed about the approach to take to China. Even the Nehru government in India did have some concerns about China, but they thought the best way to mitigate or resolve these concerns was to engage China rather than contain it. Nehru thought that bringing China into the international community instead of isolating it would encourage it to be, in language we would perhaps use today, a responsible stakeholder. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations, of course, did not see that same approach as being the correct one to China. They did think that it should be contained. Now, these differences on China might not have made a difference, but because the two countries, the US and India, did engage on these subjects, they ended up, these differences on China ended up having an adverse impact on US-India relations, not just in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, but also on Capitol Hill, where these differences on China negatively affected decisions to aid India, which needed aid at that time. And this in turn caused resentment in India that thought the US was holding back because of these differences on China. But then around kind of 1956-57, you see a change. And over the next few years, Delhi's and Washington's diagnosis of the China problem and their prescriptions of what to do about it start to converge. In the US, President Eisenhower in his second term starts to see the Cold War not just primarily as a geopolitical conflict, but also an ideological and economic one. And in this context, the US, from his perspective and his administration's perspective, could not see democratic India fall behind while Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. And they came to the conclusion that Washington had to help India win what was called then the fateful race between China and India. In India, there's also change during this period. Nehru and his officials become more concerned about China as a geopolitical threat because of the boundary dispute between them that comes to the fore in 1956-57, and it intensifies over the course of this period between 1956 and 1962. India is concerned about China's growing influence in its neighborhood, particularly in Nepal. And of course, the Dalai Lama's escape to India heightens the tension between China and India in 1959. India is also, though, concerned about the ideological and economic threat from China, just as the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations are. From the Nehru government's perspective, they were concerned that communism next door would demonstrate, a communist government would demonstrate that they could deliver the goods, so to speak, to their people, while his democratic government in India, his fledgling democratic government in India, would not succeed in doing so. The US and India didn't just agree on a perception of China now. They also agree on what to do about this threat. And primarily, in their minds, that meant a partnership with each other. Now, this agreement on what to do about it came with a lot of American economic assistance to India, which is better known, but also a military assistance that eventually culminates in, of course, US direct assistance during the 1962 China-India War. Now, you'd think that this convergence would have kind of stuck around, that both kind of agreed that this was a threat and this would naturally and inevitably lead to a sustained partnership. But it doesn't really do that during the course of the next few years. Because what happens is, while the two countries agree that China is a major threat, even the number one threat, even above the Soviet Union to some extent, they come to disagree on what to do about it. Now, still, this time, because they both see it as a threat, there's still this aspect of dependence. India still needs the US to externally and internally balance against China. The US still needs India not to fail politically, economically, or militarily while China took a leadership role in Asia. And so the US felt the need to continue to give a lot of economic assistance, but also the lesser-known fact that comes out in the recently declassified paper is that there is a fair amount of military assistance still provided during this period. There's also an intelligence sharing relationship that develops. There's also the signing and existence of something that's signed in 1963, an air defense agreement, that essentially commits the U.S. To mutual consultations with India in the event of another Chinese attack on India, in which case the U.S. would come to India's assistance. There are also strange things, like a joint expedition, a U.S. India expedition up to the Himalayas, where they decide that they're going to put a nuclear-powered monitoring device for reconnaissance on the kind of nuclear program that the Chinese were developing. That device is apparently still lost somewhere up there. But there's also kind of at this point, while there's this dependence and continuous need for each other that kind of keeps the two countries stuck with each other in some sense, there's also disagreement and disillusionment. And the disagreement comes on things like how to spend resources, whether India should be spending more money on defense expenditure against India or concentrating on development needs. Whether Pakistan should be part of India's China solution, as the US was arguing, or was Pakistan part of India's China problem, as Delhi was arguing. There's also a difference. There was a difference on whether India should have a more exclusive partnership with the US and its allies and partners, as obviously Washington wanted, or whether India should actually maintain a diversified portfolio of partners that included significantly the Soviet Union, as obviously Delhi was pursuing. And finally, there was this difference over whether, and disillusionment about whether the other country was indeed capable of playing a helpful role in Asia, in each one of these countries' China strategies. Both started to get disillusioned with the idea that the other, even if they wanted to, could they play this role as they got more and more involved in other commitments. So you see this kind of mix of dependence and disillusionment, or you hear it very kind of significantly in a phone call that takes place in 1965 between President Johnson and his then US ambassador to the UN, Arthur Goldberg. And President Johnson is fed up with India to some extent. He says, I'm doing everything I can for them, but they're not economically performing, they're not delivering. I'm fighting for them in Vietnam, for all of Asia, and these guys are not doing anything. The rant is a little bit more graphic, let's say, but since this is kind of a PG-13 event, I won't repeat what he said. But he goes on this rant, and Goldberg just says, why don't you just let India fail? Let it go communist. Why do you care? And Johnson says, no, no, no. I can't do that. That's what they said Acheson did with China. In other words, he couldn't lose India just like the Truman administration had lost China, which had both a strategic and significantly for Johnson a political impact on Democrats. But as this time goes on, during the course of this Johnson administration, towards the end of the administration, it starts to become clear that India won't quite fail or go communist, and it can manage to defend itself against China. It comes off quite well during a 1967 border skirmish with China, and there's a sense in the US that India will not fail if it's left kind of on its own. India, on its part, gets a little bit more confident, and you see China as a driver in the relationship essentially fade, if not cease, over time. And so you see the US and India during this period, towards the end of this period, essentially kind of drifting away. Now, over the next kind of decade, the last decade that this book covers, you see overall a period of disengagement, but with one key period of divergence at the beginning, once again driven by China. But this time, this divergence is different. And it's in a different way thanks to China-US rapprochement, which takes place at the beginning of the Nixon administration. In the lead up to and during what comes in 1971 in the South Asian context, the India-Pakistan war that eventually leads to the formation of Bangladesh, the China-US rapprochement means that India found that during the course of this crisis, it could not depend on the US coming to its assistance if China intervened on behalf of Pakistan. And you saw Nixon and Kissinger backing Chinese partner Pakistan, which was serving as a channel to China at the time. Indeed, this kind of vision of needing to back Chinese partner Pakistan leads kind of Nixon and Kissinger not just to kind of support Pakistan, but to even encourage China to intervene in the war on behalf of Pakistan. This, of course, leads to the low point that many of you know about in the U.S.-India relationship that is remembered to this day, the sailing of the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal. It also led to the deepening of Indian engagement with the Soviet Union because of the treaty that's signed between the two countries in 1971. After this period, you do see kind of a period of disengagement, because while India-Soviet relations start to deepen, U.S. India engagement in the final period that this book covers is one essentially of disengagement, not just because of the war, but significantly because with the rapprochement with China, the U.S. no longer really needed India as a counter in Asia. And India, on its part, now had a Soviet insurance policy and also moved towards acquiring an independent nuclear deterrent. Nonetheless, India was wary of overdependence on Moscow, and so it essentially sought to do two things during the course of the Ford and Carter administrations and the Indira Gandhi and Morarji Desai governments in the case of India. These two things were essentially to stabilize relations with the US, what we would perhaps today call a reset, and get it back on an even keel. And the second was for the Indian governments to seek their own rapprochement with China. And essentially, the US supported and even encouraged this because the US, on its part, did not wanted to limit US or the Indian partnership with the Soviet Union. And so during the end of this period, in particular the Carter administration, you see essentially this kind of triangle come full circle. In 1949, you had seen India encouraging China and the US to engage in that first meeting between Truman and Nehru. And now, by 1979, you see the US encouraging China and India to engage. And you see this reflected in a meeting that this book ends on. And it's between President Jimmy Carter and the Indian foreign minister at the time, somebody called Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who 2 decades after this period of disengagement, from that meeting where Jimmy Carter is saying, stay the course on rapprochement with China, even though you're upset with China for the China-Vietnam War that had just taken place. 2 decades after that, you really do see us back again at the point of convergence on the subject. 2 decades after that meeting, Vajpayee is, of course, prime minister, and we see the beginning of this present phase of convergence, whereas former Indian National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon put it, convergence on China has become the strategic glue in the US-India relationship. So I'll end with saying, what does all this past? This is kind of a lot of kind of detailed past stuff in the book, which I enjoy doing, and I hope you enjoy reading about it. What does this past of this book say about the present and future? There is more detail on this in the book, and we'll get to it in Q&A, but I'll essentially say 2 things. One, it explains a lot of the historical baggage regarding China, regarding partnership, regarding alignment in the US-India relationship, historical baggage that to this day affects and shapes how the two countries see each other in the context of a rising China. To give you one example, you cannot understand Indian concerns about a G2 or a US-China condominium without understanding India's sense that in 1971, essentially overnight, much like the Japanese called it Nixon shock, India had to face going from having a US partnership against China to the prospect of a US-China-Pakistan, facing a US-China-Pakistan partnership against it. A second thing beyond kind of the historical context that this lays out for the present day is this book tries to offer some insights on the possibilities and limitations of what we think of as a US-India partnership with China. There's some, and Ambassador Bob Blackwell has been amongst the foremost in saying this, that a US-India partnership is inevitable if there's a rising China that's seen as a threat. There are others who say it's an impossible partnership. It will not happen because India doesn't do alliances or even alignments. And what this book lays out is that a US-India partnership, even an alignment against China, is possible, but only when certain conditions are in place. And if you read the book, you'll find out what those conditions are. And I will stop at that point. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.